Well, good morning, everyone. Here we are finally at our first seminar, on our first year of the seminar and our first meeting. And thank you all again for bearing with our distanced community. Of course, we imagined this when we started planning this idea that it would very much be in person. We'd make a solid morning of it. We might share a lunch or a prayer or a mass afterward in some way. But we quickly had to adapt to this, so I'm glad we can all be virtually present from all the places that we're dialing in from. I've put up our little screen here. You can see our title for today, and I know you've done some preparation for the reading. I'm just going to do some introductions briefly about what we're up to, and just to provide some context to kind of remind us after our summer has been over and now we're back in the semester, just to kind of orient what we're doing and why today. And then in just a few minutes, no more than 10, I will pass it off to my colleague, Professor and Father Luke Dysinger at the seminary, who's going to be sharing the first presentation for our first session. We'll go until 10:30. We'll take a short break. I'll put on some elevator music or something. You can step away for a bit and take a break for your eyes. And then we'll come back at 10:45 with our second session and our guest, Dana Joya, who'll be joining us at that point. So let's, I'm going to stop this here, so we can all see each other better, maybe, at least from my end. All right, fantastic. I just want to say a few words just to orient and talk about why we're here. It's good to see all of your faces. Some of us met over our virtual, again, unfortunately, virtual brown bag lunch a few weeks back. Some of us are just meeting each other. I hope you all enjoyed, or at least dealt with, the sometimes cumbersome but useful Flipgrid platform where you can get a sense of all of us who are around the table. And it's the kind of thing we might have taken some extra time for to do just around the table in person, but without that facility, I thought we could make use of that. So if you haven't gotten a chance to do that, please do, and we can keep moving forward. Okay, I thought I would say just briefly a few words about what is this Nova Forum enterprise that you find yourselves in, and then briefly about the topic that we're going to focus on today, and then just a couple words about actual procedures, so how we can manage our full screen participation. So when I describe Nova Forum to people, and I suppose this is not news to any of you, but it really is the intersection of four things that we're trying to do. It is something about learning, so there is some intellectual activity involved. It has to do with something that the university is not doing on its own, that we want to supplement from the perspective of church tradition, not to be in any sort of antagonism with the university, but to come alongside and supplement with other perspectives, questions, maybe hopefully holding together oppositions from the church tradition that the university doesn't do of its own energies and interests and priorities. Third, it's obviously something out of Catholic tradition in a broad sense. And fourth, it does touch upon something in the contemporary world, something of contemporary interest in the church or in the world or in both. So those are going to be sort of some guiding stars for us as we pick which topics to invest in. We could have done a lot of different ones for this seminar. Maybe something, I think things that fulfill all of those. The body exposed, that thinks about the precarity of the human body, maybe even in unhoused or homeless populations, but also thinking about traditions of the exposed body in Christian art and representation in Jesus's vulnerable body, at least since the Middle Ages and some Franciscan traditions. That could have been one we did. We could do one on the city. We could do one on the truth of images. These are all things that Catholic tradition could speak to in a broader way that are also of contemporary interest. But we've chosen Utopia, future hopes in Catholic imagination. And so we're thinking about a couple different ideas there. How does the Catholic tradition imagine human ends? And I find that to be a rich word because, of course, it has those two meanings of our ends as a limit, the limits of humanity, especially our finitude and our death, but also human ends in the terms of the telos, the final, where the final purpose of human life and where is human life going in the Catholic imagination. And when we use the word imagination, of course, we mean it in a rich way. in a constructive way, in a participatory and analogical way that Catholic tradition usually stresses, which is to say, not that imagination means that something is, imaginary or false, but that this is the way that human beings participate creatively in constructing through word and image what we learn in Scripture and in tradition. So we'll be thinking about that, and we'll be fortunate in a couple sessions to have a presentation from Professor Cynthia Colburn at Pepperdine, one of our senior fellows here, using art historical materials as well as simply textual materials. But the other side of this is that it is thinking about how do human communities organize themselves? What's the best mode of life that anticipates, to some measure, in some limited way, a future communion with God and with each other? And you heard some notes of that from the text that Father Luke circulated, especially from Pope Benedict XVI in that last writing. So we're thinking also about, in the broadest sense, the polis, the city, the politics, not focusing narrowly on our election year, but at least having that in the back of our mind, I think, inescapably, that we are in a situation of, obviously here we are in Zoom, of some crisis globally, and of a great deal of change, uncertainty, transition, unfortunately recently, political violence. So this is all at the front of our minds. But I'm hoping we can take a step back and ask a version of the questions we're all asking in the kind of larger frame and the larger ambit that the tradition provides. So that's what we're up to today in our particular seminar. That's what we're up to in Nova Forum. Let me just say a few pragmatic words. I thought we were going to have some other guests visiting us in the background, but I see it's just the 22 of us, which is all well and good, perhaps all for the better. I do want to say a word of thanks, people who are not here, but who are very much in the background making all of this happen, especially Father Richard Sun-Woo, the pastor of Church of Our Savior, Jamie Capetta, the president of the Carusos Catholic Center, and Father Dorian Llewellyn, the new president of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. These are all people who are contributing to the resources that make all of this possible, and we're in their debt that we can have this new initiative jointly from both sides of the Nova Forum. Also, I would say some pragmatic things we've learned. I appreciate if you can, if you're willing to, if you could keep your video on so we can be face-to-face. I think we all know these conventions by now. If you could keep the audio off. I think Father Luke is going to have a presentation to share, so we'll be doing some sharing screen there. We're going to do our very best to make sure that Professor Dana Gioia can be patched in over the break. I hope that all goes well. We will see what happens with that. You never know. Everyone cross fingers. Yes. And, but one other thing I've learned in my seminars and my classes so far is just how to manage a good conversation. I mean, we're still very much in the learning process. But what's been helpful that I've found is if you want to share, if you have something to share, a question, a comment, an intervention with something else that's been said, we'll certainly have some ample time for that. If you could use the blue raised hand feature, and then I will use the chat to acknowledge people in the order that I see. I'll do my best to be accurate, right? But I'll put up, for example, yes, some of you are finding that. That's good. So I'll put up, for example, Anna, Jack, Anne Marie. So I'll put 2 or 3 names in the chat, and then you'll know that you're up next. That way we can keep some sort of order so that we can make sure we all participate. Okay, and I'll do my best to sort of balance, as I found, the order of hands going up, but also making sure we're circulating the discussion as broadly as possible. So that's what we'll do. Father Luke is about to share his materials and begin on our first session here, which we're calling Imagining the End, Human Futures. And we're going to hear about some of the patristic background of some of these ideas and some of the texts you've been preparing from Father Luke. And then we'll go until 10:30 and we'll find a good moment to pause at that point for a break. So most of all, welcome everybody. We're very glad you're here. And I hope you and all of your families are well in the midst of everything going on. And I will pass over the reins to Father Luke.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I need to tell you how grateful I am for the opportunity to share with you some of the things that I find most exciting about our Catholic heritage. And the question then arises of how to apply it to our circumstances, to our situation today. And hopefully that's something we can discuss and reflect on as we go along. The texts that I've provided you with, and we're going to look at some of them, and we're certainly going to look at the images, are really an opportunity to become aware of, I think, some of the best of what our heritage provides us with, and then what we can in turn make use of and share with others. But also, we live in a very rich time. One of the sources in particular, the text by Gregory of Nyssa, is part of our heritage, but as Catholics, it really only comes into our heritage in the 1800s and 20th century, because the rediscovery of the Eastern Catholic tradition and of the Orthodox tradition is a relatively modern phenomenon. So this is very much part of ours now. It's in things like the Liturgy of the Hours, and it's very much a part of what we tap into. But it also reflects the fact that our understanding of our heritage, our appropriation of it, is an ongoing dynamic reality. And so part of what we're going to do today is look at that dynamic reality and maybe in our own way contribute to it. Let me look at a couple of, or put up a thing or two. And let me also see if I can adjust these features. Good. I thought we would organize our thoughts this morning, or at least during my presentation, around three Greek words. Anastasis, which literally means resurrection, standing up again, rising up. It's the term that's technically used to refer to the resurrection of Jesus, both in the scriptures and in theology. A term that is becoming much more popular in Catholic and even in Protestant spirituality today, theosis, which literally means divinization or deification. Not a term that the Western Church, not a term that the Catholic Church has been completely comfortable with. Instead, it often goes by the name of sanctifying grace in classical texts, but nevertheless is what you might regard as a kind of a point of rallying at present that is enabling people to ask again important questions, both from the past and in the present. What does it mean to live out Christian faith? What effect does that have on the world around us? What effect does it have on us? And what really is our ongoing dynamic relationship with God? And what does it look like if we try to project it into eternity, into the future? And this term divinization is used very, very widely in the Christian East. And as I said, is becoming more widely used in the West. I could point to some texts in the Catechism of the Catholic Church where we're being encouraged to try to use it, to try to understand it, and to make it a part of our evangelization process, how we talk about what God is doing within us. And finally, a more controversial term, apokatastasis. It literally means restoration, bringing back again to a point from which one started, or in a more dynamic way, one could say, fulfilling the promise made in the beginning, allowing things to become again what they were really intended to be if there's been a false start of one sort or another. And in a kind of a sort of a superficial way, it's the doctrine of universal salvation, that somehow God, in God's infinite mercy, will not allow anyone to remain abandoned, cut off, separated, and that somehow what is necessary for every soul to be brought back into union with God will be done in the eons of eternity, and that somehow the end will not be a situation in which there is anything lost. The end will truly be a restoration. Now, I have to admit candidly, this term, this idea, this concept was formally condemned at repeated ecumenical councils, and it's been raised more recently by such notable theologians as Hans Urs von Balthasar as a possibility we have to look at, a question we have to ask. And the text that I've given you by Pope Benedict admits the ancient nature of this issue, this question, and tries to look at it afresh, while at the same time affirming the significant reality of human freedom, and that there is a freedom to separation as well as to union. Well, all these ideas, these three terms, resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, what we call the Paschal mystery, including both the passion, the pain, all the things that go along with the events leading up to Jesus' crucifixion and rising from the dead, the whole Paschal mystery is then participating in a certain sense, pours itself out into an act of sanctifying and deifying, and then a kind of a bringing back, a restoring into union with God, which is the action of salvation. And the question that needs to be asked is, how do I appropriate it? What does it mean for my neighbor? And what does it mean for the whole of the universe? Well, I'd like to begin by looking at some pictures, some images that I think bring together these ideas. The first is the 14th century illumination of the Hours of the Passion from a book of hours. Now, this was an extremely special book of hours because it was commissioned by the brother of the King of France, who happened to have lots of resources to bring together among the very best artists to create miniature images that could be used to help meditation on the Christian mysteries and daily prayer. This image of the betrayal of Christ in the garden is absolutely fascinating because the artists who are depicting it are using the spirituality that was present in their day to try to understand and show something of what it means for Jesus both to have suffered and to heal. And I'd like to just point out a couple of elements in it. First of all, notice that there is swirling violence around Jesus. There's a soldier on our right and our left who has grabbed him. Weapons are being raised in the background. Judas is reaching up to kiss Jesus as the sign of betrayal. And notice that he hasn't quite kissed him yet, so he still has his halo. He's still among the saints because he has not actually engaged in the act of turning Jesus over to his enemies. So there's this swirling violence, and it includes Peter on the left. Peter is holding his sword and wiping off the blood, which he got by cutting off the ear of the poor young servant who is lying at Peter's feet. So you have this ironic image of Peter, who claims to be, the powerful defender, who's actually doing exactly the wrong thing. He's participating in the violence with which Jesus is surrounded. And he's wiping his sword, and you have this swirling violence. At the very top, a soldier is holding up a lantern, but notice that the lantern is empty. It's not showing forth its light. And in St. John's Gospel, you have this very significant central statement, and it was night. Well, all of that is happening, and in the midst of it all, Jesus is reaching out with his hand and healing the destruction that his disciple Peter has caused. So in the midst of violence, in the midst of the worst that human beings can do to one another, Christ is somehow a figure who can reach in, as it were, absorb the violence, transform and transmute it into healing. So he's reaching down and turning this scene of violence into one of compassionate love and renewal. Well, that is, I think, a very wholesome way of looking at the Passion of Christ as something that is transformative, it is something that is healing. And indeed, in the Western Church, in the Catholic Church, even before all the liturgical reforms that occurred in the 16th century and then in our own time, there was a strong emphasis on meditating on the Passion. What does it mean for Christ to have undergone all of this pain? Perhaps recent filmography is an example of this. The Passion of the Christ is by some regarded as not just sort of religious, but even a horror genre because of the violence that it depicts. How do we look on this and make sense of it that also has as its center healing, or a healing that actually transforms? And in the background lies this idea of restoration or theosis, of divinity imparted to us. Well, if we turn from, as it were, an image of Good Friday to the image that is used in the Eastern churches to depict Easter, This is the anastasis icon, but in fact it is a painting in the Kora Monastery in Constantinople in Istanbul, but it is the standard Eastern Church depiction of resurrection. And in Greek, the word anastasis even rises up above the head of Christ. Now, interestingly, in the West, when we think resurrection, we think usually of a depiction of Jesus coming out of the tomb or rising up out of a stone casket. And this is often the way it's depicted in Western art. But in the East, resurrection is what we in the West emphasize as being Holy Saturday. It is quite literally the descent into hell. This is an image of Christ having undergone his passion, reaching down into the place of greatest separation and pain and death. And in the midst of the place of the dead, he's reaching out with his hands to Adam on our left and to Eve on our right. He is saving, redeeming, and drawing into union with himself, ultimately into heaven, our fallen first parents. And this is understood as being an allegory of exactly what Christ does for us. He descends into every place of suffering, of abandonment, of isolation, reaches out, grasps our hands, and draws us into union with himself, a union that literally leads into eternity. So the Eastern Church will depict not the rising up from the tomb, but the descending down into the darkest and most vulnerable place as the center of the most important experience that we need to meditate on in resurrection. I'm going to stop sharing only for a moment here so that it isn't just pictures that we see. I'm going to turn now to a text, and I'll stop talking in about 9 or 10 minutes, but I'd like to turn to a text which really is one of my favorites from the whole of the Christian tradition. It is an Eastern Christian text. It is of unknown authorship. It is attributed to Pseudo-Epiphanius, so even the attribution acknowledges that we don't know who wrote it. My guess, as a patristics scholar, is that it probably dates from around the 6th century or thereabouts, based on the imagery that it uses and the kind of language that it employs. And my reason for wanting to share it is that I think, especially for Catholics, for whom images of the passion and of the suffering of Christ are so frequent. I mean, the Stations of the Cross are in our churches. Meditation on the passion is such an essential part of our Good Friday observance. This text has recently, that is, since the 1960s, been inserted into the Liturgy of the Hours as the thing we are supposed to meditate on Holy Saturday. When we meditate on the descent into hell, the descent into the underworld, what does that mean? When we recite that in the Apostles' Creed, what the heck do we think it means that Christ descended into hell? Well, this text, in a very beautiful way, tries to depict Christ as healer. And with regard to the question of restoration or divinization, the thing that lies in the background is that the primary ancient metaphor or image for God is not judge, is not the one who decides between the sheep and the goats. The primary image or metaphor in antiquity is God as healer, God as physician. Christ has the power to reach out and to heal every kind of brokenness that exists in humankind. And in this reading, there's a kind of an evocation of ancient metaphor and myth and notions of magic. And somehow it all comes together as a way, I would say, of inviting us to ask the question, how does this Paschal mystery that is so central in Catholic teaching, what does it mean for me? How does it heal my brokenness? How is it meant to touch me? Why should I look at horrible things like, Jesus at the pillar, Jesus being scourged, Jesus being stripped? What does all of that mean in a positive way for healing and transformation? And that's exactly what I think this text tries to depict. Again, you find this in the Liturgy of the Hours for Holy Saturday, and it begins with, and by the way, this is a part of a longer sermon, which hasn't been fully translated into English as far as I know, but I have to say, I think the very best parts of it have been made available to us today. It begins with this fascinating phrase, something strange is happening. Ti tuto in Greek. What is this? What is this thing? Something weird is happening. There is a great silence on earth today. So this is Holy Saturday. Jesus is dead. He has descended into the underworld, and something is happening. And by the way, there are wonderful apocryphal stories. We might be tempted to call them legends or fairy tales from the 2nd and 3rd century that try to talk about what happens when Jesus goes into the underworld. Who does he talk to? And how does Satan react? And what about all the angry fallen angels? What's their reaction? You find things in the Gospel of Nicodemus and various other sources. But this is a much more sophisticated text that is intended to make us ask the question, how does Christ enter into the hell of my own heart? What does it mean for Christ to enter into the brokenness that I bear inside me? There is a great silence, a silence and stillness. The whole earth keeps silence because the king is asleep. For those who are interested in ancient literature, this is the mythology that the land and the king are tied together. If the king, the ruler, is healthy, the land will be healthy. If the king is sick, the land will not prosper. The trees will wither, the crops will not grow. Well, this is evoking that idea that the king is asleep. The king of the universe, the one who made the universe, has died, is in the sleep of death, and so the earth is silent. There was trembling and the earth was still because God has fallen asleep in the flesh and has raised up all who have slept ever since the world began. Another kind of ancient Christian idea that you only find once in the Gospels, that somehow Christ's resurrection so touched death that there were dead people who rose up and began to walk around the city of Jerusalem. Again, not much of a subject for homilies these days, but an interesting notion of somehow there is this link between the earth that God has made and God in God's self. God has died in the flesh and hell trembles. What's he doing down there? He has gone to search for our first parents as for a lost sheep. There's this beautiful blending of imagery from Jesus' own teaching, that he is the good shepherd, desiring those to visit those who live in darkness, again, straight out of the Psalms, and in the shadow of death. He's gone to free from sorrow the captives, Adam and Eve. And here is this beautiful, again, there's this playing back and forth on humanity and divinity. He, Christ, who is both God and the son of Eve. And so the Redeemer is actually going to save his own parents. Christ, who is descended of Adam and Eve, goes as their son and the Son of God to rescue his own ancient father and mother. There's this rather cute depiction of Christ bearing the cross, and an almost an action that comes out of the liturgy. My Lord be with you all, and Christ answers, and with your spirit. So it's as if there is this liturgical dialogue that takes place in hell, in the place of the dead. And Christ says, raises up Adam and says, awake, O sleeper, rise from the dead. Christ will give you light. Again, borrowing from St. Paul, I am your God, who for your sake have become your son. There's this beautiful fluidity of imagery between the God who has become not only human, but has become our child, and now redeems that which we are. Out of love, I, by my own authority, command all in bondage to come forth, those in darkness to be enlightened, sleepers to arise. Arise from the dead, for I am life of the dead. Arise, work of my hands. Plasma to emon. You are that which I created. Arise, my likeness, created in my image. Leave this place. And then a beautiful statement of relationship. I am in you, and you are in me. Suenamoy, kago, and soy. This is straight out of Jesus' high priestly prayer in the Gospel of John. Together we form only one person, prosopon, a term that was debated endlessly in the 5th and 6th centuries about how do we talk about the relationship between the divinity and the unity in Christ, and the relationship between the second person of the Trinity and the whole of God. Well, here that debate is made highly personal. We are in a union with God that can be described as one person. And then there's this beautiful dancing back and forth between opposites. I, your God, became your son. I, the Lord, the ruler, took the form of a servant, a slave. I, whose home is above, descended to the earth. I became free among the dead without help. And then there's this transforming of the ancient imagery of fallenness. For the sake of you who left a garden, I was betrayed in a garden and crucified in a garden. Now the garden has been consecrated. This power of divinization, this theosis, has touched even the place that was thought to be the symbol of our abandonment, of our fall, the place out of which we were expelled. Now suddenly the garden is renewed. And then each of the elements, and this is the thing I really think is important for our own meditation on the Passion, each of the elements of suffering becomes an element of healing. See on my face the spittle I received to restore to you the life I once breathed into you. The mark of contempt, spitting in the face of another, becomes the kiss of life to the dead. The marks of the blows I received refashion your warped nature. My scourging lifts up the weight of sin. My hands heal the hands that you stretched out to the tree in the original garden. I slept on the cross, the sword pierced my side and brought forth Eve. Somehow there is this new birth of life on the cross. My side heals the pain in yours. The sword that pierced me has sheathed the sword that was turned against you. The flaming sword of the angel that was to keep out human beings from paradise after the fall. Christ has sheathed that angel's sword by being touched by a sword. Now, this is the ancient tradition of sympathetic magic, that the wound can only be healed by something like the thing that inflicted the wound itself. But it's being used as a way of inviting us to look more deeply, not at the superficial question just of pain or suffering that Christ endures, but to see that as somehow God entering into all forms of human betrayal, suffering, separation, and transforming them, literally divinizing them. So arise, leave this place. The enemy led you out of earthly paradise. I will enthrone you in heaven. So somehow the garden is transcended. The tree that was a symbol of life, well, I, who am life, am now one with you. Beautiful images of, and I have to mention, I've added this sentence from the original. The makers or the creators of the Liturgy of the Hours, I think, probably found it a little bit too explicit. You hid yourselves as if naked from God, but behold, hidden within you is the naked God. God is really, truly inside you. The throne awaits you, the bridal chamber is adorned. Eternal dwelling places are prepared. The treasure of all good things lies open. The kingdom of heaven is prepared for you for all eternity. Well, that text is something the church offers us as a way of meditating on the Passion. I hope it can be a little redeeming of some of the stuff that, that Mel provided us with in the Passion of the Christ. It's not just about torture, it's about healing and transformation. And perhaps we'll have a chance to look at some more images of transformation the next time I'm granted the ability to offer a little tirade with us this morning. But I think we were going to have an opportunity for interaction, David, is that right?
Yes, by all means. Thank you, Father Luke, for getting us started with those too rich images and this mysterious but marvelous homily from an ancient voice. The traditions put together by millions of hands, some of whom we know and some of whom we don't. And it's always, as Father Luke said, a great moment when, and part of the work of scholarship, this great retrieval of patristic heritage, which really, doesn't really take root in the church's life until the early 20th century, very recently. If you didn't know that, this is a something that we're all great beneficiaries of, but the situation looked very different 150 years ago. I appreciate the opportunity for students to jump in and for hear, especially from our junior fellows and from our senior fellows, about your own responses, starting with these images and this homily, or if you wish to draw a connection to some of these other rich materials, the catechetical oration from Gregory of Nyssa that has some of the ideas about the apokatastasis, this idea of a universal restoration of all things to God, and then the rich poetic passages from Marlowe and Goethe on the Faust legend, which we can talk more about, and of course the text from Pope Benedict XVI. Please, Father Luke.
And so we're going to have a period of interaction, but I was hoping to be able to say just a word about those texts as well.
Let's do that. Well, let's focus then on what we've just spoken about first, about the images, the links between suffering and healing, or questions you have about this basic notion of anastasis or resurrection and the parallels that Father Luke has put up. I'm going to do my recognition here. We'll start with Benjamin and then go to Claire. And for those of you who are better at this than some of us, can you remind us, can someone unmute themselves and remind us all, how do we find the blue hand to raise?
Please, thank you.
It's just in, oh, sorry, it's in participants.
You go to participants, you find your name, and there's a blue hand option there. Is that right, Hannah?
It's at the bottom of the window when it pops up. It's a little gray box that says raise hand. You won't be able to find it probably because you are the host.
I see. Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for that help. If anyone has questions, just send me a question in the chat privately. We'll start with Benjamin, then we'll go to Claire, and then Danny, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, go ahead, Benjamin, the floor is yours.
I was, and maybe we want to do this later when we talk about Faust, but I thank you, Father, for pointing out that Judas's halo is still seen in that image. I think it's a very right before they kiss, and I want to connect that to in the Faust narrative between Marlowe. There's all this language about Faust possibly being a godly person, and this idea of free will. I mean, cut is the branch that could have grown full straight, I think is the line, if I can find it, yeah. And there's this image that we have the possibility of being redeemed, but that we choose not to in some ways. That was my thought, just to connect Faust to the image.
And my thought is just an English major, random thinking, just about the beauty in the homily of how each of the components of destruction and of death are completely restored in the anastasis way. It's almost like the literary term Chekhov's gun, where in Chekhov's writing, everything that's put into a story becomes used. And so I just think it's a really beautiful and compelling component of the homily and of the passion and the resurrection narrative, is that every component, everything that is done is intentional, is deliberate, and is brought back to fullness of communion with God. I just love that.
A sort of full return of all the elements of suffering into redemption, with no extraneous suffering for the sake of suffering, but all of it is in this very, as the homily emphasizes, it's very tactile. It's very haptic, right? It's about the naked flesh and the Creator touching, and all of these images that are so intimate.
And it's not punitive. It's not that somehow God has to be placated by lots and lots of suffering, by the suffering of that which is closest to him. No, the suffering is what we do at our worst, but the worst we can do, God can transform into healing.
Danny.
Yeah, I had more of a question, I think, in terms of like the two depictions of the descent into hell. Because I do think that like one of the more obvious distinctions between the two is how the more contemporary one is a lot brighter in terms of the background behind Jesus Christ. And I'm just wondering if that's like just a difference between the depictions of the East versus the West, or just based on, you know, the times and what was available.
I think it's probably more to do with materials.
Okay.
The Cora Anastasis, the picture from the church, is a fresco, and they hold up very well, but they do fade over time. whereas the picture was made by someone imitating that more recently.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Good question. We'll go to Audrey next and then Victor.
Oh, I also have a question. I was wondering about where these images are located. If you maybe know the history around where they were painted, like a church or anything.
Yeah, the image of the betrayal is one of the illuminations from a part of we would call it the Liturgy of the Hours, but it was something intended for lay people. It was not intended strictly for the clergy. It had psalms that could be prayed at every one of the hours of the liturgical day, plus a whole set of meditations on the Passion of Christ and a whole set of meditations on the Blessed Virgin Mary. These were very, very popular from the 1200s onwards. In fact, they were so popular that you can still afford to buy little pages of some of those individual manuscripts because there were so many of them that they were prayed to pieces, and now individual pages are being, unfortunately, sold. So this was from a book, but it was a book commissioned by a very wealthy duke. So it's, if you will, very high end in terms of what it was intended to be. But it was intended to be a visual aid to help people meditate. You looked at the picture and it helped you understood more about the text. In the same way, the Anastasis, the resurrection fresco in the church of the Cora in Constantinople was intended for meditation during the liturgy, during prayers. It's one of several that you would look up and see that kind of draws together what you understand God to be doing for you.
Victor.
Yeah, thank you. I also have a question. I also like very much this text we read, along with the Easter proclamation, the Exultet. But it's problematic because it makes reference to Adam and Eve and original sin and creation.
Yes.
And that leads to other stuff like the existence of Satan as a real person and not as a force. So which would be interesting readings to understand this from a contemporary perspective, linked to tradition, I guess, for young people overall?
I think to some extent, although it's a little sophisticated, the text I provided from Pope Benedict is one thing that tries to make those connections. All of those things that you described, okay, yes, the church acknowledges the existence of all of that, but the reality is, if you don't look past it or into it or try to understand the deeper meaning that lies behind it, all you end up with is mythology. All you end up with is a story that may or may not affect your life. But I mean, this idea of God reaching down into the Adam and Eve in me, because I am human and they are a depiction of the fallen humanity, and that somehow God heals that. I think that's something we have to constantly work towards. You don't abandon history or historical questions on the one hand, but you do constantly point out history is not enough. The story is not enough. The story has to reach beyond itself. So,
Thank you.
And that selection from the Benedict XVI was part of a whole volume on all of these topics together. If you're interested in that book, as we'll probably say many times in the course of the year, get in touch with myself or one of the other senior fellows and we'll point you in the right direction for more resources. That's a large part of what we'd like to do, is to be a kind of guide to things that we found fruitful that we can pass along to you. We're going to go next to Andy, Professor Colburn, and Mary, and then we'll go back to Father Luke and we'll pick up where we left off there. So Andy, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. I just found it interesting that in the homily you mentioned, as someone else mentioned, that violence has like this transformative, like Jesus can, transform violence into something good, something healing. And I just wanted to relate that to something that we're going to discuss later, the Catholic writer today. Dana mentions that Flannery O'Connor, her fiction is full of resentment, violence, and anger. Good and evil appear to be joined in every culture at the spine, she observed, and violence is strangely capable of returning her characters, quote, to reality and preparing them to accept their moments of grace. So I just thought it was interesting because I never thought of violence that way, as something that can be healing, something that can be transformative.
A great connection. Thank you, Andy. Professor Colburn.
And there's so much here and so many connections I was seeing too. So it was a great connection, Andy. I was just looking at the composition of the manuscript page that you showed and your comment on Peter, and it really resonated with me. But looking at the composition of it as well, where even the artist places Peter in this complicated position of both, he still has his halo on, but physically he's placed both in the chaos and the negative and the violence. But then he kind of occupies this complicated and liminal space. It's more of a comment than anything else, but it's amazing how the artwork works with the interpretations that you're seeing in terms of his role.
And the imagery of Peter wiping his sword of violence, which, if this is from the, what are we thinking, 14th, 15th century? I mean, relatively late medieval?
Yes.
There's plenty of memory of the violence of Peter's sword where that could take on more meaning, right, than if it were just simply an image we find in a 3rd or 4th century text, right?
It's a chaotic and feudal time that's trying to find its way forward, but at the same time, rich resources are available, especially to folks with means. It's a fascinating and very complex period.
Mm-hmm. And to sort of flag an issue that Professor Colburn herself will be showing us in a few weeks or months, the idea that we need to read images in the same way that we can, listen to text and experience them in different dimensions. But especially for most of the Christian past, the majority of lay people are illiterate. And so images take on an important function, much more than just our very narrow, sometimes vocabulary of, art historians would never make this mistake, but the rest of us might think that they're there for illustration of a textual reality. Whereas it's very much the other way around, and this idea of meditating with an image is a perfect reminder of that. Mary, and then we'll go back to Father Luke.
Yeah, thank you. Kind of going back to this idea of violence, I just got from both the first picture and then again in that reading, just like the chaos going on and how they're still healing. And then when you go into the homily, it just like, I don't know, Jesus is healing in the first picture amongst chaos, but then Father said how like something strange is happening, but he's also then entering into like the chaos in our heart and like transforming and healing there, which I just thought was like an extremely beautiful image and just like something awesome about our religion, our faith. Like who could do that? I just thought it was like a beautiful context between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's in many ways, the Eastern Church would talk a lot about theosis, about divinization. The Western Church, the Catholic Church, would tend to emphasize consecration, meaning, especially when you consider the Eucharist, that you have this amazing thing, which is, bread and wine, or at least that's what it appears to be, but God makes it into himself. You can't see it, you can't taste it as divine, but in fact, it's God. So therefore, there can literally be a taking of all or anything that has been created, and God can draw into it, not just a divine meaning, but a divine presence. Now, of course, it has to be offered. Violence and suffering have to be touched by God. It's not that they are themselves redemptive. They may be cathartic, but they aren't themselves redemptive. But when offered to God, it turns out that they had a meaning and a purpose, a telos, a goal, different from what we thought. And that somehow it achieves a meaning and a power and a purpose that wasn't imagined.
Thank you. This is a great first round of discussion. Let's keep that going. I think Father Luke wants to present some more of the materials that you had there.
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm not going to do a lot with Gregory of Nyssa's homily, although I do encourage you to take a look at it, because here again, this is something that the Western Church has rediscovered and reappropriated and is very much trying to make its own. Gregory of Nyssa, who is a saint, he's celebrated as a saint in East and West, one of the great teachers or doctors of the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity, and one of the great mystics of the Church, had an image of heaven, of our goal, that is not static. It isn't the achievement of a perfection that once you've achieved it, there is no change. He coined the term epectasis, which is used in St. Paul's letters to describe the runner who is straining forward to achieve the goal. And what Gregory of Nyssa and some of his predecessors meant by that was that in heaven, there is no end to our becoming more and more in Christ. That our desire, far from being satisfied, is sharpened and deepened, and our desire achieves its goal not in being satisfied, but being discovering that there's always more of God to want, to desire. So heaven is very dynamic. It's a movement, a constant movement that is never boring, that is never, as it were, complete, and yet one is in the presence of that which is the completion of all things. Very, very beautiful, and again, much more moving in the sense of dynamism model than you sometimes find in the Christian West. Well, he also believed in the apokatastasis, in the restoration. Part of it because, as the text points out, God is already in all things, and through Christ, he who holds together nature and existence is mixed. Fascinating words, based on Greek words like krosis, which is also a medical term for the balance within our various parts of our bodies that gives us health. Christ is mixed within us or transfused into us so that our nature might become divine. So here's this theosis. God saves us by making us more and more into what God is. God imparts his divinity to us. And that therefore Christ's return from death is our return to immortality. Now, he emphasizes this image of God as healer to the extent that it extends even to the deceiver, to Satan himself. The deceiver is deceived. Satan doesn't realize what God is doing by becoming human. God is engaging in such an act of transformation that even Satan himself will be touched by it. Lots of medical terminology used here, the idea of healing through a thing that is like the poison that caused the original disease. But finally, he says, he confers benefit on the lost one, not just us who are lost, but on him who had wrought our ruin. So Gregory suggests the possibility that healing and transformation will reach out even to those most fully separated from God, even to the devil and to the demons. And you can imagine this is the reason for the condemnation of this doctrine. If in your preaching you find it necessary or you think it's advantageous to threaten people with an eternal hell, then you are not going to be very fond of theologians who suggest that God's purpose will be achieved even in those who have separated themselves from God, that there is no fully eternal hell, that there is what we might call an ongoing purgatory that may last for ages and ages, but ultimately God's love will be available to and ultimately will be embraced by all. So he then goes on to say that even the adversary will not dispute that what Christ did was saving, that the demon or the devil will have a perception of benefit. And then he uses this word restoration. God's goal is to bring us back to what we were originally intended to be, apokatastasis. Interestingly, this is also an astronomical or astrological term, that as the stars every few centuries return to a configuration like those that they had long ago, there is a restoration of creation. So it was used in pagan Greek and Roman thought, and here it's being appropriated by Christian theologians to mean that God will restore the state from which we have fallen. So finally, he says, God accomplishes all the results, freeing humanity from evil and healing even the introducer of evil himself. Now, interestingly, Gregory of Nyssa is never condemned as a heretic. On the contrary, he is extolled as a great doctor or teacher of the Eastern Church. But this doctrine of eternal salvation is always regarded as dangerous to preach, for the reason that if you think everybody's going to be saved, well, why be good now? So you will find, repeated emphases on the danger of this doctrine. And the other point that the reading from Cardinal Ratzinger from Pope Benedict mentions is the danger is that it, in a certain sense, diminishes the importance of human freedom. That in a way, when we talk about a doctrine of hell, and Pope Benedict admits and talks about all these theologians who talked about eternal salvation. The danger in all of this is saying that somehow God is going to override human freedom. What if I don't want to be in union with you? What if I don't want to be in union with your God? What if I don't even want to bother knowing more about myself? Just leave me alone. Does the power to say that extend through all eternity? And the great ancient philosophical way of asking this question was, can habit become essence or nature? Can hexis become ousia? And it remained a debating point. You know, if I do the same thing, if I separate myself over and over again, do I become separation? And what if someone trying to intrude on my separated state is experienced by me as pain, and I don't want it? Can my choice of solitary isolation be extended through all eternity? And those who believe in this apokatastasis would say, somehow the love of God will triumph. Somehow all will be enabled to embrace what they were made for. And yet there is this terrible question, but what if they don't want to? What if, does human freedom remain eternally? Is it a characteristic of the human person that cannot be, or by God's grace, is not ever unmade? Well, let me just look at a couple of, very briefly, and I'd love to spend more time on them, literary examples. A couple of the points from Marlowe and Goethe, these two wonderful authors who played with the Faust legend, the legend that rose up around an apparently historical figure who was alleged to have made a deal with the devil for wealth and youth and power and the ability to work magic. Well, one of the intriguing things that Marlowe highlights in the mouth of the devil, in the mouth of Mephistopheles, the demon who's given primary responsibility for negotiating with Faust, according to Marlowe, there's a debate about angels in heaven. Was not Lucifer an angel once? And Mephistopheles says, yes, Faustus, and most dearly loved of God. How comes it that he is prince of devils? By a aspiring pride and insolence for which God threw him from the face of heaven. This is a punitive notion of damnation. God has cast Satan out. Well, who are you? We are unhappy spirits that fell with Lucifer, conspired against our God with Lucifer, and are forever damned with Lucifer. Where are you damned? In hell? How comes that you are out of hell? And this is a fascinating phrase. Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it. Thinkest thou that I, who saw the face of God and tasted the eternal joys of heaven, am not tormented with 10,000 hells in being deprived of everlasting bliss? Effectively, Mephistopheles is saying, we carry hell with us. I know what might have been, I knew what could have been, and therefore everything now is hellish, this separation for me. Well, for Marlowe, and again, his model of damnation is kind of contractual. Faust has made this deal, and in some ways he can't get out of it. He's also freely hardened his heart to the point that you have this very sad, almost, pathetic point at the time of his upcoming expiration of his contract. Faustus' offense can never be pardoned. The serpent that tempted Eve may be saved, but not Faustus. He has this sense of despair. It doesn't matter what I do, I cannot be saved. And then finally, there is this very interesting phrase, which Goethe will pick up on, and which was already mentioned. The devils appear and hell appears, and suddenly Faustus realizes that he's about to be damned. He says, oh, I'll burn my books. Mephistopheles. And he's taken down to hell. And the choir enters in and says, cut is the branch that might have grown full-strength. Burned is Apollo's laurel bow. Goethe surely took exactly this phrase, because unfortunately the English translation I've used here doesn't do it proper justice. Gerettet ist das edle Glied der Geisterwelt vom Bösen. Saved is the noble branch. Saved is the noble member of the spiritual world from evil. So what Marlowe could not imagine being saved, Goethe somehow does. Well, for Goethe, the transaction is not just personal, it's also social. How is Faust saved in Goethe's version of the play? Well, he has made a deal with the devil that if he ever says to any moment, beweile doch, du bist so schön, remain or abide, please, you are so beautiful. If he ever says that to a moment, Mephistopheles may snatch him away to hell. And so he, well, in Goethe's Faust, he's very evil. He seduces a woman, drives her insane. She kills her own child. She's executed but saved by God at the very last moment. Her name is Margarita. Her diminutive form of her name is Gretchen. And then finally, at the end, Goethe changes. He devotes his life to land reclamation. And when he looks back over his life and sees all the land that has been reclaimed, although what he doesn't realize is that Mephistopheles has been twisting even those actions into actions of evil, the last reclaimed land was in fact accomplished through killing an elderly, very pious couple and their defender. Well, Faust looks back over his great work of saving, reclaiming land and says to the moment, beweile doch, du bist so schön. Abide, you are so beautiful, and he dies, blinded and ancient. And somehow Mephistopheles is about to take him to hell, but the angels arrive and carry him up to heaven. How? How is he saved? Well, according to Goethe, who is no practicing Christian, it's debated endlessly. Why does he use these ancient medieval images of angels and the church fathers? Antony the Great is one of the hovering spirits in the last act, and so is Saint Bonaventure. Why is Goethe using these Christian symbols to describe salvation? Well, it's not simply an individual act. It is a social act. Faust has committed himself to helping others, and somehow Gretchen, Margarita, has been praying for him, and her prayers, and this is undoubtedly a link back to Dante, where the prayers of Beatrice are also accomplishing or holding out the possibility of the sanctification of Dante himself. Well, the angels say, whoever strives with all his power, wer immer streben sich bemüht, we are allowed to save. Den können wir erlösen. That one we are permitted to redeem. And if besides supernal love responded to his plight, the blessed host comes from above to greet him in delight. And suddenly it's the prayers of others. It's the prayers of the Holy One, and especially of the woman he betrayed, that somehow are saving for Faust. Well, fascinating, secular, very much an Enlightenment image of salvation, but cloaked in all the classical medieval imagery of the Faust legend, a fascinating discussion which denies the necessity for damnation and tries to look at other possibilities for healing and salvation. Let me share with you one final image. Someone asked the question, it'll be very brief, of redemption and transformation. One of the great Catholic authors of our day, J.R.R. Tolkien, in The Lord of the Rings, has this glorious image, which in the books is not in the same place as the movie. Refer people to the actual literature. After almost being killed with his friends, Frodo and his companions have a restful night in the house of Tom Bombadil. And either in his dreams or out of them, he could not tell, Frodo heard a sweet singing running in his mind, a song that seemed to come like a pale light behind a gray rain curtain, growing stronger to turn the veil all to glass and silver, until at last it was rolled back and a far green country opened before him under a swift sunrise. Exactly the same words are used at the end of the story when Frodo and his companions and Gandalf and Galadriel and all the rest are together and about to leave and do leave. And as they leave, you hear what it was that Frodo himself experiences at the end of the journey from the Grey Havens. The ship went out into the high sea and passed out into the west. And Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And it seemed to him that as in a dream in the house of Bombadil, the gray rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. A more contemporary vision of heaven, and even if it is a salvation only of the heroes of the story, nonetheless perhaps a kind of a hint of divinization and even of apokatastasis. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Father Luke. Those are such rich and evocative images and a great kind of foretaste for next semester when we do return to Tolkien for one of our seminars. So we'll come to that. We have a couple hands up. We'll start with Benjamin and then Professor Blakely, and then I'll put a list up from there. Benjamin.
Yeah, I'm just making this connection now in Faust when Mephistopheles talks about how they were with Lucifer, is very similar to the connection between like the theosis of Christ, but kind of opposed to him. In some ways, Marlowe connects humanity's connection to Christ as similar to being to the fallen angels with Lucifer, which kind of implies that human beings are angels or can achieve angelicness.
A very positive note on what other people experience as a rather dark text. Thank you very much.
Professor Blakely.
Thanks, Father Luke. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, there's so much there. I have like 6-7 questions. Also, just want to say hi to Andy because he's a former student of mine I haven't seen since the plague fell upon us. And his question about violence that he made, or the observation he made about violence. So I have a couple thoughts. I'll just try to gather them. One is around pastoral issues, or if you like, kind of existential psychological issues. Like what's at stake in what we're reading here? And I mean, you're a father, so you deal with seminarians, you deal with lay people in a fatherly way and trying to sort of spiritually guide them. And as I was reading the texts you sent, which are fascinating, I mean, one thing that occurred to me is like, what's at stake here pastorally, like psychologically, existentially, spiritually? If I see suffering or violence, Andy's point, as non-redemptive, if I see suffering as non-healing in some sense, I could see issues there around maybe not knowing the person of God, thinking that you know God, but really who you know is some sadist that you think is God, and you have a very dysfunctional relationship to God the Father because something bad happens to you, like COVID or violence, and you think, God the sadist, why did you do this to me? Or you become sadistic toward other people. Because I think when Andy was talking, I was thinking, well, a lot of Christians think violence is redemptive. I think most Christians think violence is redemptive, but they think it's redemptive when I do violence to you because you're not being a good Christian. And now I'll get you to be a good Christian by doing violence to you. I won't name any names, but I see a lot of Christians acting that way these days. So I guess one set of questions was just pastorally, spiritually, like what's at stake here? Like if I get that wrong, if the correction you're trying to make, if I get it wrong, what insights do you have as a father into that, as a priest, as someone who helps people? The other set of questions are really quickly philosophical, and then so I know Benedict too. I'm an admirer of his writings and whatnot. I mean, his point of view is, look, if you universalize salvation, then you're violating potentially personhood and human freedom, and you're turning. But I take it that someone like Gregory, who was, after all, probably a very brilliant, deep person, would probably come back to Benedict and say, well, there's something else at stake on the other side. And I was thinking, well, what's at stake on the other side philosophically? And Gregory has all this stuff he says about the interfusing of God. And you went to those passages that are beautiful about God is in me and I'm in God. So one objection I could conjure up, just because I'm a philosopher theorist by training, so I like to conjure up objections, but like one objection I could conjure up is, if God doesn't save everyone, but if God is ontologically infused in me, if God is in me, then God doesn't even redeem himself in some sense. Then like for all eternity, there are parts of the universe that he doesn't reconcile to himself. And you could like hash that out in a bunch of different ways. Like God isn't really sovereign, even though God is supposed to be sovereign, or God isn't really benevolent. If he's benevolent and sovereign, he would want to save everyone. If he's sovereign, he would be able to save everyone. David Bentley Hart, who's an Eastern Orthodox theologian who gets a ton of attention these days, pissed off a lot of the Catholic world by writing this book about everyone is saved. I'm not a theologian at all. I tend to just defer to theologians within the tradition. So, but I do like to, questions emerge for me around these issues. So I'm not really taking a position so much as pastorally and philosophically, like what's at stake with all this, and how would you respond to those sorts of doubts?
Two things, and it's partly also as a physician and as someone who has a lot of experience dealing with people who are suffering physically. I remember one of my instructors in clinical medicine at USC, a very, very fine woman who was a pulmonologist, once fixed us all with a stare and said, "Don't ever tell people that suffering can be very significant and meaningful. If you are taking care of them pastorally, if you are taking care of them in any way, don't ever try to tell someone else what the meaning of their suffering is." The Catholic phrase, "offer it up," which used to be used a lot, is not very consoling to a lot of people today. It can be, I mean, if it means by that, give it to God and see what happens. But if it's supposed to be, well, you know, it'll work out in the end, so don't worry about it now, that's not very satisfying either. I think the most important thing to do is to do what Pope Francis says. We accompany, we walk with people. We do not attempt to impose meaning. If your meaning of your suffering at this moment is emptiness and isolation and bleakness, that's the meaning you're experiencing. But the moment you share that with me, it begins to have a less destructive effect on you. So to make ourselves a point where people can share what they are experiencing, believing as we do, like in that reading, that whatever it is, it will eventually acquire a deeper, truer, more beautiful meaning, doesn't mean that at this moment I have to tell someone, oh, you need to have a beautiful meaning for that. No, on the contrary. What the person is experiencing is what they are experiencing. Don't try to force a meaning onto them at any point. And the Christian point where that's clear is Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I mean, at that moment, Christ, in the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" enters even into the experience of meaninglessness. You know, Jean-Paul Sartre, you've got nothing on Jesus. He enters into emptiness that is complete, and yet there's something beyond it. But don't try to transform someone else's Calvary into anastasis. Walk with them until it becomes anastasis. And your presence will make a difference. That's what I would say pastorally to the issue of talking to people who are suffering. With regard to universal redemption, my favorite theologian, Evagrius Ponticus, also believed in the apokatastasis. Part of it is because, as you say, you know, God's in everything, but also if God is the divine healer, if God is the omnipotent healer, is there any disease God can't heal? No. What about the disease of disbelief and rejection and hatred of God? And the answer would be, well, that takes longer, but God can heal that too. Now, the problem is we don't have metaphors to work out how that can happen and still be acceptable. I remember a friend of mine, another theologian who loves Evagrius, said, well, what you're talking about in terms of apokatastasis is like an eternal concentration camp. God won't stop forcing himself on you, but you don't want God. That doesn't sound redemptive. That sounds punitive. And you know, God is the ultimate controlling parent who sits down after death and says, okay, let's go over the reasons you rejected me one by one, and we've got millions of years to work this out. Doesn't sound very gentle or compassionate. And the model of redemption is supposed to be the infusion of gentleness and compassion into that which is separated. How do you encourage love in a soul for whom love is the one thing they don't want, who absolutely wants to reject all forms of love? I don't think we have an answer for that. To say we think God's going to deal with it is, well, Hans Urs von Balthasar says, the apokatastasis is not something we can preach because we don't have metaphors for it. We don't know how it works, but it is something for which we can hope.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father Luke. Yeah, I remember Von Balthasar says it's not in the category of knowledge, it's in the category of hope. So it's, we have to sort of imagine as much as we wish. We'll go to Hannah and then Anne-Marie, and we've got about 12 minutes. So we'll see how many, how much of our conversation we can have, and perhaps we can find some other technological means to sustain these conversations, but it's always a good sign when there's more than we can address. Let's go to Hannah and then Anne-Marie.
I'll try to keep it brief. What I loved so much about both the Holy Saturday text and the Nyssa text was this great kinship with humanity that we see in both of them, like exemplified in even just the language and the gentleness of the language. I loved the fact that you put the line back in of sort of this nakedness, because I feel like, I don't know, throughout Christian history, we have a lot of these periods of like sort of like closing up and like shying away from like what it means to be human in a way that puts us like as like less than, or like sort of subservient and like unworthy of God. And these texts really bring us back to this kinship, this like one in the other. There is deity in everything, which really it really contrasts sort of a flagellant view of Christianity, which I think continues to try and seep its way back into our Catholicism. I also was thinking a lot about the whole, if everyone's going to be saved, then why be good now? And especially in relation to like, why does one translation of Faust have like sort of a redemptive end, and like one doesn't? And I was thinking, I've been thinking about this a lot, especially in relation to the Benedict texts. But in that, when we have the option, which is that, that God's grace is fully redemptive, then we're not just doing things out of a selfish fear for our own damnation, but we have the freedom to do things out of true good intention, which is, I think, probably better to sort of sum it up in a
there's another strand in the churches of the East, not the Greek or Latin, but the churches that use Syriac as their liturgical language and their language of patristic study. In their tradition, you'll occasionally find images like the experiences of heaven and hell are the reality of heaven and hell is the same thing. It's just a question of whether you want the healing, transforming, fiery embrace of God, or whether you're constantly running away from it and finding it painful. Sometimes, the human experience of this, some days, well, in COVID, of course, it's different, but some days you don't want to be hugged. I do not want anyone to hug me today. Well, I could become that forever. I could make that into who I am, and that would be called damnation. But what if God is the eternal embrace? God doesn't let you go. Well, the saints experience it as joy, and the damned experience it as pain, but it's the same loving embrace.
Anne-Marie.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a reaction I had to both the Faust readings. I think I was thinking of things similar to the way that Benjamin was when he mentioned that there is something godlike in Faust, and that the way we navigate these two different endings kind of is part of how we see Faust. And I've always been interested in literary, like fictitious characters and trying to understand them through like the lens of true spirituality. And when I was reading this, I was kind of struck by the moments in the Marlowe piece in which he really looks like Jesus. And it's almost like you don't expect the damnation to actually be carried out because, for example, when he is waiting to be taken away, and there's this ticking clock moment, and the anxiety of pain before pain is exactly like agony in the garden. And I wonder, if I sit down and read this thing cover to cover, am I going to see all of these moments of Jesus's life trying to show us that there is something godlike in Faust, even though he's made decisions that split him from God. So I really, really liked the lens of Gregory of Nyssa and the Holy Saturday homily to lay over this, to read it, because I think it's really illuminating.
I'm not a literary scholar, but I find it fascinating that, in a way, for Marlowe, part of the problem is Faust has signed a contract. That's it. He signed the contract. He's bound to that contract. That's the world of the 17th century. You make your contract, you either fulfill it or you go to prison, period. Whereas Goethe, as an Enlightenment figure, is trying to expand the understanding of our social commitments, our relationships with one another. Maybe the contract is not just between me and the person I'm bound to, but society at large. And maybe if I do something for society, that changes the nature of the contract. I'm fascinated by the fact that, again, Goethe, who no one would accuse of being a pious Christian, feels forced to use all these classical medieval Catholic images in order to convey his message.
We have just a few minutes, but we'll try to get to Jonathan and then Coriana, time permitting. Jonathan.
Hello, I was just making a comment on the Catholic oration, the homily. I was just gonna say that I love how the text discusses the idea of restoration, of how Jesus restores the holiness in each and every one of us. And it comes off as Augustinian for me, and that we need Jesus in our hearts fully to restore the corruption of human nature, as well as from our sins. And without Jesus, it's much too easy to fall to the vices of sensual pleasures and material items. But what I find so beautiful about the text is that it's hopeful, and that it acknowledges the fact that we have evil in our nature, yet are still redemptive. And most importantly, it makes the issue of belief much more realistic, in that it doesn't just state that if you believe in God, you will magically gravitate towards holiness. Like, that's not the case at all. It takes constant effort on our part in order to dispel like the secular influences that may harm our beliefs. And I appreciate the text for that, for comparing the process to, say, like surgery, because I've never really thought about the redemption of evil in this context, but it rings true in many ways.
Yeah, I love the section in Pope Benedict's text where he says that for both purgatory and heaven, the essential reality is Christ. Purgation, healing, transformation is being drawn into union with Christ. Heaven is the experience of deepening union with Christ. And one might add, hell is, I mean, he doesn't say this, of course, but the Syriac, the churches of the East would, that the same thing is true of hell. Hell is the presence of the loving God. And Jack didn't think he was going to get to ask the question of, what if a person doesn't want to be redeemed? What if they find redemption painful? What if, I'm forever in the state of not wanting to be hugged by the warm embrace of God, but that's what eternity is? Well, what happens? Will I ever be warmed up? And will that warming up somehow respect my freedom? And there again, I don't know that we have the language to answer that, or the metaphors to communicate it.
Coriana.
All right. I actually wanted to kind of echo and expand what Jack is saying, because I find myself somewhat between a rock and a hard place with this, because both ideas make me uncomfortable, because it's uncomfortable to think of like people being forever damned, but it's also uncomfortable to think of people being forcibly like compelled toward redemption. And so I guess what I was thinking in light of the readings is, one thing that we emphasized was the idea that the incarnation is sort of like Jesus and God like transcending and redeeming like all violence. And so I guess my question is, what is the difference between that and sort of like something like an Old Testament like judgment where God is like responding to like or like even the crucifixion itself where God is responding to like the perversio or the turning away by judgment, and what is God responsible for that turning away, and what is like, where does sort of God start and like evil start, like what is the distinction between the two? Does that make sense?
Well, yes, and the theodicy question, the question of where evil comes from, what evil is, what happens to evil, how is God responsible for it or not responsible for it? I mean, one ends up with all these questions about human freedom, and is it primarily human freedom that's caused the problem, or what about organic freedom? What about the fact that there are pretty nasty parasites out there that one can't describe as wholesome or good in any meaningful sort of way? And that's plagued humanity as a question from the very, very beginning. And I guess one of the things we probably need to bear in mind too is that our understanding of freedom is heavily conditioned by the Enlightenment. That is, since the 18th century, what we mean by freedom is the freedom to choose something that would hurt us and something that would help us, and we have the freedom to do that, and nobody can tell me which I should choose. That wasn't the case in antiquity. Freedom, and I think that would be part of the classical answer to the question of the apokatastasis, freedom is freedom for. Freedom is for what we were made for. Freedom is to enable me to become more free. That is, the more choices I have to become what I was made for, the more fully I will be that which is my deepest potential. And if I make choices in freedom for that, my freedom expands. And ultimately, the ultimate expansion of freedom is heaven, is deepening union with the one who made me. But choice for separation, choice for hell, is decreasing freedom. That is, I'm choosing something that makes me narrower and narrower and less capable ever of choosing again. And that's the misuse of freedom. That is to say, it's not freedom, it's kind of freedom's opposite. But these are things for Jason to reflect on, because I don't know how to talk about these things as a philosopher, so.
I know we have some other hands up. Thank you, Father Luke. We may not get to them right here because I want to make sure we do have a break out of a pastoral and pedagogical, and just as a friendly concern that we all have a little time off from Zoom because it is a long time. But I hope we can use the chat to continue conversations. Obviously, when we have people are making presentations, that might not be the best time. But I found in the classroom when we're talking, especially those under 30 are very good at maintaining both conversations at the same time. So you're welcome to do so in our dialogue together and our conversations around our virtual table. Anna raises an important question, which maybe we can just make sure to come back to, about, just to clarify for those wondering, this question of the apokatastasis. Is it part of it? Is it in the catechism, for example? I believe it is not in the catechism, but when we're looking back and we're trying to sift through all the valuable different teachings of the church fathers, this is one element in the mix. Father Luke, briefly.
What is in the catechism, and it's very helpful to look at the section on original sin, is that, and the section on hell, is that hell is self-chosen. That is, hell is not a punitive action. It's not a judgment of God in the sense of a criminal judgment, that this is a crime you've committed, this is a penalty you have to experience. The phrase I think that's used is auto exclusionis. It is something, it is an exclusion that the person chooses. I choose to be excluded, and that's what damnation consists in. That's a very helpful phrase. And again, interestingly, the language that's used about original sin is that we adopt and accept a false image of God. We begin to believe not in a God who is loving and compassionate and who gives himself, but we believe in a God who is greedy and grasping and jealous of his prerogatives, and that's our operating system. That's our default. If we don't constantly think on the gospel, we will fall back into imagining that God is nasty, greedy, and jealous of his own prerogatives. I think those are helpful images. They don't answer the apokatastasis question, but they certainly don't depict damnation as something that God sitting on the rainbow decides for you because you did that.
Let me also add that we will do, the senior fellows will do the work of keeping track of all the wonderful resources that we very quickly allude to and putting together a reading list or a list of links or other resources so you can safely not worry about that. And we'll share that with you shortly after each of our sessions so you can follow up on a lot of these and of course stay in contact with all of us. So not to limit ourselves in any way. Let's take a good break. I'm going to post our little waiting room screen up for the moment, and we'll begin sharply at 10:45. So I'm sorry we don't have pastries and coffees to share as we wished, as we planned, as we budgeted, but nonetheless, you can do that on your own. And we'll step away and we'll see you at 10:45.